Tonight's presentation is a little bit different. It's titled, Is Your Mechanic a Minimalist or Maximalist? And we're going to be talking, this is actually a presentation that I made up for AirVenture 2013 and have expanded a little bit for tonight. I'll be talking about two alternative maintenance philosophies, which I refer to as maximalism and minimalism. Different aircraft owners and different mechanics adhere to different philosophies, and I just want to talk about them a little bit and let you know something about why I fall into the minimalist category. It's important to decide which camp you're in, and it's even more important to decide or to figure out which camp your IA is in, because it will have a lot to do with how your aircraft is maintained. To summarize these two competing philosophies very briefly, the maximalist view is that maintenance is a good thing, like exercise. The more of it we do, the better. The minimalist view is basically that maintenance is a necessary evil, like surgery. It's something that we sometimes have to do, but the less of it we do, the better. And we should do it only when absolutely necessary, or when the benefits clearly outweigh the costs and risks. And I fall into the minimalist camp. I'm an unabashed maintenance minimalist. Anybody who's read my my Savvy Aviator column in Sport Aviation, or any of my articles and other publications, pretty well knows where I stand or where I fall on this scale. I believe strongly in doing only the maintenance necessary to make an aircraft safe, reliable, and compliant with regulations, and that doing any more maintenance than that is not only a waste of time and money, but it actually makes the aircraft less safe and less reliable. And that's why I believe that maintenance is inherently a bad thing. It's something that we have to do, but we shouldn't be doing any more than absolutely necessary. And I'll illustrate that tonight with a whole bunch of war stories. This less is more maintenance philosophy is one that served me very well for decades, originally as an aircraft owner, then later as a mechanic and a manager of maintenance for many, many hundreds of aircraft. And it turns out that this minimalist philosophy has actually become an established science called reliability-centered maintenance. I've done webinars and articles on that subject. And it is a philosophy that has been widely adopted throughout the aviation world by airlines, military, high-end biz jets, and actually has been adopted well beyond the aviation space in safety-critical industrial applications like nuclear power plants and offshore oil platforms and that sort of thing. And pretty much the only part of aviation that still adheres to the maximalist philosophy is owner-flown general aviation. Owner-flown GA, as we'll talk about a little bit later, is something like 50 years behind the rest of aviation when it comes to how we maintain our aircraft. And this minimalist philosophy, although it is universally adopted in other parts of aviation, is typically heresy to many general aviation mechanics, particularly the older ones, who were taught in A&P school that maintenance is a good thing and that more maintenance is a better thing. And I have to deal with these maximalist mechanics and IAs all the time in my managed maintenance practice. And sometimes our debates get pretty interesting. And I wanted to illustrate the perils of maximalism and why I believe in a minimalist philosophy by telling you a few stories about actual aircraft owners and some of the things they've gotten into. And I'm going to start by telling you the story of a good friend of mine by the name of Frank Robinson. Frank flies a 1978 Cessna Turbo 310R, almost exactly the same airplane as the one I fly, except that Frank's is one model year earlier and has way better avionics than my airplane. In fact, as you can probably see from this picture, Frank's Cessna Turbo 310 is probably the most over-improved Turbo 310 in the world. If there is a goodie, he has installed it. Frank flies the heck out of this airplane. He literally commutes to work in it almost every day. He lives in Santa Barbara, and he is a marketing consultant that works with clients, well, actually all over the United States, but a lot of his clients are up in Silicon Valley. So he pretty well has flown a groove from Santa Barbara up to the Bay Area and back, and he flies that trip a couple of times a week. He uses the airplane a great deal, and he absolutely depends on its reliability because effectively he uses it to commute to work. Frank, up until very recently, used a very well-known twin Cessna specialty shop in Southern California, a shop that knows these airplanes very well. But the IA who runs that shop is an absolute maximalist, as we'll see. At his 2010 annual inspection about 3 years ago, the IA told him that his props would have to be pulled off and sent out for overhaul at a cost of about $6,000 because it had been 6 years since they were last overhauled. Now, indeed, these props are McCauley props, and McCauley says that the TBO on these particular props, they're McCauley C504s, is 2,000 hours or 72 calendar months. That's 6 years, whichever occurs first. But Frank is a Part 91 operator, like most of us, and so he's not required to comply with any manufacturer's TBO recommendation. So this TBO from McCauley, suggesting that the props be overhauled every 6 years or 2,000 hours, is really a mere suggestion for Frank. It's not a regulatory requirement. Nevertheless, the IA, who, as I mentioned, is a maintenance maximalist, said that he wouldn't sign off Frank's annual unless the props were sent out for overhaul. Frank consulted me, as he usually does. Sometimes he follows my advice, sometimes he doesn't, but he usually solicits it. So he asked me what I thought he ought to do. I suggested to Frank that he not overhaul his props at 6 years because, first of all, the McCauley 6-year TBO, like all calendar time TBOs, is based on a worst case aircraft, typically an inactive aircraft that's parked outside in a high corrosion environment like South Florida. The 6-year TBO has been established because of concern about internal corrosion in the propeller hub. But Frank hangars his airplane. He flies it several times a week. He is in a much lower risk of corrosion because of those two things. And there is no history of accidents caused by exceeding the 6-year limit. I read hundreds and hundreds of accident reports. I'm an information junkie, as probably most of you know. And frankly, I have never heard of a single accident caused by a propeller, a high-time propeller coming apart in a piston aircraft engine. I have heard of accidents in turboprops, which have much more complicated propellers. But there's literally no history of accidents caused by not overhauling the props every 6 years. And in fact, I have similar props to Frank's, and mine haven't been overhauled in more than 20 years. So I practice what I preach. In any case, I suggested to Frank that he go to his IA and try to make a deal with him. And he did. He asked the IA whether he would be willing to sign off the annual without removing the props if Frank promised that within 2 weeks after the annual was signed off, he would fly the airplane to a nearby propeller shop at San Luis Obispo Airport, and have the propeller shop look at the props. And if the prop shop said that they thought the props needed overhaul, he would overhaul the props. If the prop shop said that they thought the props were okay to continue, then he wouldn't overhaul them. The IA reluctantly agreed. Frank was a longtime customer, and against his better judgment, signed off the annual without doing the prop overhaul. Frank proceeded to fly his airplane to the prop shop. It's the shop owner who I have known for years and is a maintenance minimalist like me, and you don't find a lot of prop shop people who are minimalists. But this guy is very experienced. He's been overhauling props for decades. He looked at the props. He asked Frank some questions about how he operated the airplane and how he stored the airplane, and concluded the exact same thing that I concluded, that it would be silly to overhaul the props before they reach 2,000 hours. So Frank didn't overhaul the props. Another thing that came up the next year at the 2011 annual at this same Twin Cessna specialty shop in Southern California is that the IA told Frank that the main landing gear torque tubes should be removed and sent out for X-ray inspection. The torque tubes are part of the landing gear retraction mechanism in Twin Cessnas like Frank's. This is what they look like. They're a big steel welded complicated component with something called a fork bolt at one end, as you can see, that operates the landing gear retraction system. And these torque tubes have a history of developing cracks. The crack is a spiral crack. It always initiates at the fork bolt boss and progresses in a spiral fashion around the torque tube until eventually the torque tube fails, and during gear retraction it splits open, pretty much like a poppin' fresh muffin can, if you know what I'm talking about. And there are lots of SDRs about these torque tubes cracking, and the IA was very insistent that these torque tubes be pulled off and sent out for X-ray inspection. Frank consulted me. I advised him not to allow the IA to remove the torque tubes for X-ray testing because, first of all, in my experience, virtually no torque tube that goes out for X-ray testing ever passes the test. It's the vast majority of them flunk. So the act of removing the torque tubes and sending them out for testing is pretty much a guarantee that they'll be condemned. They're very expensive to replace. I think they're $2,500 a piece. There are 2 of them on the airplane. And most importantly, they always fail the same way, and the failure is a benign failure. The way the torque tubes fail is that you retract the gear, the torque tube splits open like a poppin' fresh muffin can. That particular landing gear remains down and locked. The pilot sees that one of his green lights hasn't gone out and that the red light doesn't go off. He puts the gear back down and lands. There, to the best of my knowledge, has never been a case of a gear collapse or any collateral damage caused by torque tube failure. When the torque tube fails, that particular main landing gear simply fails to retract. No big deal. So my recommendation is to not go through this testing, which almost always results in having to buy new torque tubes, and do what literally every other Twin Cessna shop in the world does, which is simply to inspect the torque tubes visually for cracking. and not remove them from the airplane and not send them out for non-destructive testing. Now, if the torque tube failure mode resulted in gear collapses or other damage or accidents or injuries or something like that, obviously, I would feel very differently. But the point is that this is a failure whose consequences are benign, and in my view, there's no reason to be spending tons of money on non-destructive testing and replacing torque tubes. Well, in any case, Frank listened to my arguments and decided to follow the IA's advice instead of my advice. So he had his 2 torque tubes removed and sent out for X-ray analysis. One of them came back red tagged by the shop. The other came back green tagged by the shop. In an abundance of caution, Frank decided to replace both of his torque tubes with new ones from Cessna, paid about $2,500 each for the new torque tubes, and I don't know, 4 or 5 hours of labor for the removal and reinstallation and so on. At the next annual, at the 2012 annual, the IA discovered that these new torque tubes had been improperly manufactured by Cessna and had been rubbing against the wing ribs in the wing during gear retraction and damaging them. Cessna fessed up to their error, supplied 2 additional torque tubes. So now Frank is on his 3rd set of torque tubes. Cessna provided the replacement torque tubes free in this case, but Frank once again paid for the labor for removal and reinstallation. Then at the 2012 annual, we had an interesting situation come up having to do with an airworthiness directive against the exhaust system of these airplanes. In the 1990s, and there's some history behind this, I was quite heavily involved in the development of this AD. In the 1990s, there were a number of fatal accidents in turbocharged twin Cessnas, like Frank's and mine, caused by the failure of exhaust system components. And as a result of those accidents, the FAA issued an airworthiness directive, which I helped write, on January of 2000, requiring, among other things, that the exhaust systems with more than 2,500 hours time in service be replaced, overhauled, or recertified at the next engine overhaul. And I think, yeah, I did miss one item here, that during the development of the AD, we literally researched every single twin Cessna exhaust accident. And what they had in common was that they were high-time exhaust systems with more than 5,000 hours on them, and many of them had been weld repaired in an incompetent fashion. And that's so the combination of the high time and, in many cases, improper weld repairs were causing these exhaust systems to fail and causing accidents. So the FAA issued this AD 2001-16 that called for the exhaust systems with more than 2,500 hours on them to be replaced, overhauled, or recertified at the next time the engine was overhauled. The reason that the AD was written that way was because the FAA was convinced by people like me that taking the exhaust system apart and putting it back together entailed a great deal of risk that the exhaust system wouldn't go back together correctly, and that the inspection of the exhaust system should therefore be done only at times when the exhaust system had to be removed anyway, which typically occurs when the engine is removed. So that's the AD was written in that fashion. Here are the exact words in the AD having to do with the removal and recertification of exhaust system. It provided an initial compliance time. It said at the next engine overhaul that occurs after the accumulation of 2,500 hours time in service since installing a new or overhauled exhaust system. And then if the exhaust system did get recertified, which is very unlikely because the high time exhaust system probably would not pass the test, just like a high time, just like the torque tubes. But in the event that the exhaust system passed the recertification and went back on the airplane, which almost never happens, there was a repetitive compliance time that said thereafter it would have to be removed and recertified at intervals not to exceed 2,500 hours or 12 years, whichever comes first. Note that the initial compliance time doesn't have a calendar time component, but the repetitive compliance time does have a calendar time component. Well, Frank, being the very cautious guy that he is, when this AD was first issued back in 2000, he decided in an abundance of caution to replace his exhaust system right then and there with new ones. It wasn't required by the AD, but Frank was aware of all of the exhaust-related accidents in twin Cessnas that had been caused by AD problems, and decided that he would sleep better at night if he replaced his exhaust system. So he put a brand new exhaust system on both engines in 2000. At 2012, by the time he got to the 2012 annual, his exhaust system had accumulated 1,800 hours time in service. So it was still relatively young. But at that annual, the IA at this shop told Frank, that the exhaust systems would have to be removed because they were now 12 years old. Frank called me. I advised Frank not to let the exhaust system be removed because the AD didn't require it. He hadn't reached 2,500 hours, and even if he had been at 2,500 hours, the AD didn't require the exhaust system to be removed until the engine was removed. I had Frank pull up the AD and read the wording for himself. He concluded that my interpretation of the AD was right and the IA's was wrong. But the IA insisted that he was right and went ahead and removed Frank's exhaust system anyway. Frank got upset, decided to escalate the matter. He called the owner of the shop. The owner of the shop, who was between Frank and the shop's IA, decided to call the Wichita Aircraft Certification Office of the FAA, which was the office responsible for this AD, and the Wichita ACO took it under advisement, and 2 days later came back and said that they agreed with my interpretation, not with the IA's interpretation, and the removal was not required. The IA still believes he was right. He's still removing exhaust systems at 12 years, but the FAA itself said that it wasn't required. And Frank wound up getting his money back, getting the shop to refund the money that they'd spent removing his exhaust system unnecessarily. By now, Frank kind of learned his lesson, and he has now stopped using that shop and is using a different shop in Southern California that has a much more reasonable maintenance philosophy, at least in my view. I did a webinar that I'll just summarize very quickly about a disastrous Cirrus SR22 annual that we wound up bailing the owner out of trouble. He had bought his airplane new in 2003. This was another fellow who flew the airplane a lot. He used it to commute to work. He typically was used to spending about $5,000 or $6,000 for his annual inspections. And but in 2010, he decided to use a different service center, one that he'd never used before, and that turned out to be a big mistake. That service center, who obviously was a Maximalist service center, inspected Alan's airplane, presented him with a discrepancy list containing 89 items and a repair estimate that totaled nearly $25,000. Alan freaked out, called me. He actually was in India at the time on a business trip when he got this $25,000 estimate. He called me and asked him if I could help. We got engaged with this thing and started going over this 89 discrepancy $25,000 repair estimate. And this is a summary of the most expensive items on the estimate, where the last thing on the screen is 50 additional minor squawks, but I've listed the most important ones here, because most people would look at this and say, how can an annual possibly be on a single engine airplane possibly cost $25,000? Well, here's how it can cost $25,000. At any rate, we went over this list, and to make a long story short, we noted that all of these items that I've circled in yellow are not items that there's anything wrong with. These are not things. These are not really discrepancies. They're not things that came up in the inspection as being somehow unairworthy. All of them or almost all of them, are time-directed items, replacing hoses at 5 years, and drain seals at 5 years, and alternators at 500 hours, and that sort of stuff. And that's really where most of the money was in this big estimate, is replacing things. A 6-year propeller overhaul, of course, a standard 6-year propeller overhaul, 4-year overhaul of magnetos, 2-year battery replacement, so on and so forth. All things where we're replacing an item that is working just fine. There's no inspection finding that the item has a problem with it. It's simply that it got to some particular age, either in calendar time or in hours, and the manufacturer recommended replacing or overhauling the item at that point. We almost always recommend saying no to this sort of thing, and that indeed is what we did in this case. So we went through this whole discrepancy list with a fine-tooth comb, recommended declining a whole bunch of the items that really we felt weren't required and weren't going to add any safety or reliability to the airplane. They were just checking off items on a checklist, and we wound up reducing this invoice from almost $25,000 to about $8,000, which is still more than Alan was used to paying at an annual. That was just a penalty for picking this particular shop, but it was about $17,000 less than what the original estimate was, because there was just a whole lot of stuff on there to say no to. And it got a little testy for a while between us and the IA, but ultimately he came around, and we got this thing cut down to something reasonable. Finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about top overhauls. Top overhauls are a pet peeve of mine. They're very, very common in my experience. They're almost never warranted. We always recommend to our clients against doing top overhauls. And the reason is very simple. It never happens that you put an airplane in for an annual inspection and all of the cylinders on the engine are unairworthy. That just doesn't ever happen. Typically what happens is you put your airplane in for an annual and 1, maybe 2 cylinders are unairworthy for some reason. They got a burned exhaust valve, the compression is below minimum and can't be brought up by the various methods that we try to use to bring compressions back up. But it's never the case that you put an airplane in for an annual inspection and all the cylinders are bad at the same time. But it's just amazing how often mechanics recommend replacing all the cylinders just because 1 or maybe 2 of them have a problem. We always recommend against doing that, and one of the reasons we recommend against it, not only is it wasteful to replace a cylinder that's still airworthy, but it's very risky to do that. The top overhaul is one of the riskiest maintenance operations that you can do on an aircraft. And unfortunately, I have had the misfortune of serving as an expert witness on at least a half a dozen lawsuits that arose out of air crashes caused by improperly executed top overhauls. So we always recommend against it because it's uncalled for, it's expensive, but most importantly, it might get you hurt. Show you just a few pictures of some of the top overhaul lawsuits and accidents that I've gotten involved with one way or another over the last few years. This one is a Bonanza, I guess an F-33 Bonanza that fell out of the sky through a rod. The pilot, who was a CFI, made a landing in a vineyard, and unfortunately, the airplane came down crosswise to all the wires in the vineyard, and so the forced landing resulted in a very, very high rate of deceleration. Both of the occupants of the airplane were hurt, and the right seat occupant, who's the passenger, had very serious head injuries and permanent brain damage that will affect him for life. It was a very unfortunate accident. The cause of the accident turned out a great deal of forensic work was done, as is typically the case with accidents like that result in lawsuits. And it turned out that a cylinder came off in flight, and the reason the cylinder came off in flight was because the mechanic who installed the cylinder used a small dab of sealant called TCM gasket maker. This is a very good sealant to use on lots of things, but no kind of sealant or anything else is allowed when you're installing a cylinder. And even a tiny bit of sealant on the cylinder base O-ring, which is where he applied it, will extrude onto the base flange, ultimately cause the hold down studs to lose their preload, and the studs will shear and the cylinder will come off, and that's what happened. That's what brought this airplane down. Just a tiny dab of sealant applied in the wrong place. It's a really big lawsuit. I think it was, I don't know, a $12 million lawsuit or something. Here's another one that I was involved in as an expert witness for Continental Motors. This was another very tragic accident involving a A36 Bonanza that took off out of Santa Monica with a doctor and his wife. It had a catastrophic engine failure not long after takeoff through a rod. The pilot attempted to turn back and make a landing on the beach. He didn't make it, but he made an extremely good ditching. And when the aircraft was dragged up onto the beach, you can see that the airframe was still in very, very good condition. Unfortunately, the pilot had not installed shoulder harnesses in the A36, and both he and his wife hit their heads during the ditching and apparently were knocked unconscious. The airplane sank and they drowned. As I said, if they had shoulder harnesses, this accident would have been eminently survivable, but unfortunately they didn't. When we looked at the history of this aircraft, the engine had undergone a top overhaul just a few hours before the engine came apart. The mechanic who did the top overhaul, let me just be charitable and say that he had no business working on a piston engine. All his experience was with turbine stuff, and he screwed up the top overhaul, and a bearing spun, and actually the rod, the number 2 connecting rod sheared, and threw the number 2 rod through the side of the case, and the engine came apart. Here's another similar one with a much happier ending. It was a B-36 TC Bonanza, a doctor back on the East Coast who had the engine throw a rod less than 10 hours after 3 of the cylinders, all the cylinders on one side of the engine, had been replaced, and the work was done improperly, and about 10 hours later the engine threw a rod. He made a forced landing where he didn't bend any metal and he didn't get hurt, but obviously the engine came apart, and he was in a very mountainous area at the time, and it was only his cool thinking and skill that prevented this thing from turning into a major tragedy. Here's one of our own Cirrus clients that went in for an annual. The shop replaced 2 cylinders, and those cylinders actually had to be replaced. They had burned exhaust valves, but apparently the mechanic got distracted and he failed to torque down the screws holding the rocker covers on. And so 10 or 15 hours later, I forget, on a dark, moonless night at 14,000 feet over the Florida Panhandle, this engine cratered. Our intrepid aviator, aircraft owner, doctor, made a beautiful dead stick landing on a little airstrip in Marianna, Florida. And if you look at the pictures that were taken right after the accident, you can see that the left rocker cover there is completely gone. There's no sign of either the rocker covers or the 5 hold-down screws. The right rocker cover is hanging by a single top screw, and the other 4 screws are missing. So clearly the mechanic neglected to torque these screws down. Maybe he put them in finger tight, and then the Snap-on truck came by, or the phone rang or something. He got distracted. Kind of stuff happens all the time. And the rocker covers came off. The engine threw all of its oil overboard, and it wound up throwing a rod and cratering the engine. I've just been involved in too many of these things, and so I'm very, very squeamish about multiple cylinder replacement at once, and particularly top overhauls. I always try to discourage my clients from doing top overhauls because of the risk and because there's really no compelling reason to do it. But they don't always take my advice. And I'll be telling you a brief story later about a client that this is something that just came up in the last 2 weeks that I'll tell you about. But in any case, I am an unabashed maintenance minimalist. I don't believe that more maintenance is better maintenance. Usually it's worse. And my philosophy in maintaining my own airplane and in maintaining my clients' airplanes is to perform only the maintenance that clearly is either required by regulation or clearly contributes to making the aircraft safe or reliable. If it doesn't meet that test, we don't want to do it. This is a lesson we learned many years ago. I wrote an article for EA Sport Aviation a couple of years ago called The Waddington Effect, about a British scientist, Conrad Waddington, C.H. Waddington, who got drafted into the Air Force during World War II. He's British, and he was assigned during the war to something called the Operations Research Section of the Royal Air Force Coastal Command, where they did research for the Air Force on all sorts of interesting projects. But the most interesting project, at least to me, that he was involved in had to do with trying to figure out how to improve the maintenance on the B-24 Liberator bomber fleet that the RAF Coastal Command was using to drop depth charges on German submarines. And he discovered, as part of his research, an interesting phenomenon that became known as the Waddington Effect, where he plotted the number of unscheduled repairs, in other words, squawks, that came up on these airplanes as a function of how many hours it had been since they were in the shop last. And at the time, these airplanes went into the shop every 50 hours for not only an oil change, but a whole bunch of other preventive maintenance. And what Waddington discovered in his research was that the more hours since the airplane had last been in the shop, the less frequently it broke. And at no time did the rate of squawks start to increase until it was time to go back in the shop for the next preventive maintenance cycle. The number of squawks continually decreased over time until the airplane went back into the shop for its next 50 hour. And his conclusion, which is pretty obvious when you look at the data this way, is that scheduled maintenance tends to increase breakdowns. And this can only be because it's doing positive harm by disturbing a relatively satisfactory state of affairs. And he pointed out that there was no sign that the rate of breakdown was starting to go back up after the 50 flying hours when the airplane went back into the shop for its next scheduled maintenance cycle. So as a result of this research, the Waddington's group recommended and the RAF adopted a new maintenance policy, which increased the time between scheduled preventive maintenance and eliminated a great number of the maintenance tasks that they had been doing, and only did those maintenance tasks that were absolutely proven to be beneficial. And as a result of these changes, the number of effective flying hours, what we would call today force readiness of this B-24 fleet, increased by more than 60%. So the less maintenance they did on these airplanes, the more reliable they were. This very same discovery, and all of the work that Waddington did was classified and didn't get unclassified until 1975. But the airlines rediscovered this same thing in the 60s, that the less preventive maintenance they did, the more reliable the airplanes were and the less downtime they had. And they started drastically cutting back on maintenance. And the reason for this is simply that maintenance is, as I said, like surgery. It's inherently invasive, and anytime you do it, there's a chance that a mechanic's going to screw something up. The more invasive the work, the more likely that there's going to be a maintenance-induced failure, or mechanic-induced failure, if you like. There is nothing that you can do to an airplane that's more invasive than doing a top overhaul. As I said, this minimalist philosophy, which became known as reliability-centered maintenance, was adopted by all of the air carriers in the 1970s. There's a standard for reliability-centered maintenance that is maintained by the Air Transport Association. It's called the Maintenance Steering Group Number 3 Report, or MSG3 for short. In the 80s, the philosophy was adopted by the military. In the 90s, it was adopted by all sorts of non-aviation industries that had similar maintenance-intensive, safety-critical kinds of activities. So this is sort of the timeline of how maintenance philosophy has evolved until most of aviation is now doing things in this reliability-centered kind of minimalist way, where the focus is not on doing scheduled overhauls and life-limiting things to TBO and so on, and doing things on fixed timetables. The emphasis is on doing very good condition monitoring and finding incipient failures before they become actual failures. So we emphasize inspection rather than time-directed tasks. And also a big part of RCM is doing what's called failure effects analysis, which is analyzing the consequences of the failure and not trying to prevent failures that have benign consequences. That's the kind of thing that we were talking about with Frank's torque tubes. Why get all hot and bothered about torque tube cracks when the crack typically can be found by simple visual inspection? But if the worst comes to the worst and the torque tube cracks, it's no big deal. The landing gear just doesn't retract. You put the gear down, you land the airplane, and you go fix it. It's not a big deal. It's not going to hurt anybody. It's not going to cause collateral damage. So why get all hot and bothered about these cracks? It's really, I mean, cracks in an exhaust system are very serious. Cracks in a landing gear torque tube are not serious. We have to be thinking about not only the failures, but what the consequences of the failures are. And we should be focusing our maintenance dollars on trying to prevent failures that have serious consequences, and not trying to prevent failures whose consequences are acceptable. Unfortunately, most piston GA maintenance today is still being done using the second generation approach that dates back to the 50s. We're way behind the rest of aviation, and as a result, aircraft owners tend to do way too much maintenance, spend way too much money on maintenance, and incur way too many maintenance-induced failures that wouldn't happen if a more minimalist philosophy was used. So let me wrap this thing up with one more war story, and this is one that just came up in the last couple of weeks. It involves a client of mine who has a 2002 Cirrus SR22. My company manages about 10% of the Cirrus aircraft in the U.S., so we have a lot of Cirrus war stories to talk about. The short version of the story is the owner decided he was going to sell this aircraft. He actually was buying a twin Cessna, and he wanted to sell his Cirrus SR22. So he listed the airplane with a broker, and then while the airplane was listed for sale, for some reason he had a compression test done. I'm not sure why he had the compression test done, because it wasn't time for his annual inspection. But he had a shop do a compression test during an oil change or something, and one cylinder had a compression that was below the master orifice threshold that Continental specifies as their airworthiness limit. The other 5 cylinders had mediocre compression, but they were all airworthy compression readings. I think one was in the high 40s and the others were in the 50s and 60s. But one cylinder tested low. We recommended to the owner that he replace that one cylinder, but the owner decided he was going to have a top overhaul done and replace all 6 cylinders. So he pulled all 6 cylinders, sent them off to a very good cylinder shop that we recommended for him. The shop inspected the cylinders, advised the owner that none of the cylinders were repairable because they all had too many head cracks to overhaul. It just wasn't economical to repair them. And that's typical, by the way. By the time a cylinder reaches TBO, more than 75% of cylinders have numerous cracks in the head. They're not safety issues. They never cause accidents or anything, but they technically make the cylinder ineligible to be overhauled. So at any rate, his 6 cylinders were retired. He wound up buying 6 brand new ECI Titan cylinders, put them on the engine, and then shortly thereafter, he started complaining about an oil leak. He had the airplane in a couple of different shops looking for the source of the oil leak, and eventually, about 30 hours after he had done the top overhaul, the source of the oil leak was found. It turned out to be a crankcase crack at the aft side of the number 2 cylinder, at the 7th stud hole down right between the number 2 cylinder and the oil cooler. So now he has a cracked crankcase. The engine is now trash and unairworthy, with 6 brand new cylinders on there that have less than 30 hours on them. And so now the owner found himself facing replacing the engine with a factory rebuilt engine 30 hours after spending something like $15,000 doing this top overhaul that we recommended he not do. He was not a very happy camper, obviously. We contacted Continental Motors on his behalf and negotiated a really good deal for him where, first of all, Continental would give him full core credit for his engine even though it had a cracked crankcase, and second of all, they would let him keep his 6 ECI cylinders and pistons that were only 30 hours old and that probably he'll be able to sell on eBay for $4 grand or so. So it was, you know, we got an exceptionally good deal for him out of Continental, but he would have been a whole lot happier had he not decided to replace the cylinders, and we urged him not to do that, but he did it anyway. At any rate, that's that's it. This is some of these stories will tell you, will help you understand why I have come to the maintenance minimalist philosophy that I have, that believes in doing only that maintenance that is either specifically required by regulation or that clearly will make the aircraft more safe and reliable. And if maintenance doesn't meet that standard, I recommend declining it. If sort of in short, if it ain't broke, don't let them fix it. And Tim, that's it. Here's a list of the upcoming maintenance webinars that we'll be doing on the usual first Wednesday of every month. And I've got some interesting topics. The last one is kind of fun: how to flunk an annual inspection. We'll have some fun with that one. And in any case, I think we should have probably a half hour or so for Q&A.
Great, thanks, Mike. We do have some questions that have come in here, so I'll just dive right into them here. Jonathan says, if you're going beyond TBO, you monitor the top end health with engine monitoring and bottom end health with oil analysis, ? Is that enough monitoring for the bottom end, crank, etc.?
Well, actually, engine oil analysis is sort of a secondary tool that we use for monitoring the bottom end health. The most important, by far, tool that is used for monitoring the health of the bottom end is oil filter inspection. And if we find anything interesting in the oil filter, which we sometimes do, then there's a whole protocol that we follow for what to do next. I actually did a whole webinar on that, but frequently, for example, if we find anything interesting in the oil filter and we don't have a ready explanation for it and it's not obvious where the metal is coming from, we'll send it out to a laboratory for scanning electron microscope analysis, and they will come back to us with a report that tells us exactly what alloy that metal is made of and exactly what the shape and size and quantity of the particles found are. And given that information, we can very, very frequently figure out precisely where the metal is coming from. And often, surprisingly often, when an engine starts making metal, we're able to trace the origin of the metal to something that can be fixed without removing the engine from the airplane, because the metal will frequently be coming from an accessory of some sort, or something that a starter adapter or that sort of thing that can readily be repaired or replaced without actually removing the engine from the aircraft. I have one of the webinars that I did that's online on the EA video server is a webinar on the subject of when to overhaul an engine, where I go through the process that we use to decide when it is time to overhaul an engine, and I actually give a specific list of conditions that would trigger the decision to overhaul an engine. But obviously, we are not big believers in overhauling engines at TBO. We don't want to overhaul an engine unless there's some good reason to do so. It's no secret that the engines on my airplane are well over 200% of TBO, and that I don't have any plans to overhaul them anytime soon. But the day that they start talking to me and telling me that it's time, that's the day that they will come off for overhaul. The top end stuff, we don't believe in ever letting top end stuff, in other words, anything having to do with cylinders, affect the decision to overhaul. Cylinders are bolt-on accessories. When we have problems with cylinders, we fix them. We, if necessary, unbolt the cylinders and repair them or replace them. But cylinders can be repaired in the field. They there's no requirement or no need to be pulling an engine out of an airplane and sending it off to an engine shop for teardown because of anything that's wrong with cylinders. And as I indicated in this webinar, we don't like pulling off all the cylinders at once. In fact, we don't like pulling off more than one at once unless it's absolutely necessary. Usually it isn't. And we believe in repairing cylinders as they require repair and not before.
Okay, great. Dan says, we had a crack around a cylinder bolt boss. The mechanic sent it out for x-ray and repair. Was that a smart choice?
You know, I'm not sure what he's talking about. I don't know what kind of engine it was, and I'm not sure what bolt he's talking about. So maybe he can submit another more detailed question to you before we quit. Maybe I can give him an answer. But just from what he said, I really don't understand precisely what he's talking about, so I can't give you an intelligent answer.
Okay, he came back with it's an it's a i360 and cylinder number 3.
Well, I still don't understand what a bolt boss is. There are through bolts that go through the entire engine from one end to the other. There are cylinder hold down studs that thread into the crankcase and hold down the 6 of the 8 cylinder hold downs or studs. There are no bolts on a cylinder, so I'm just not sure what bolt boss he's talking about.
Okay, he said it was where the top bolt comes out of the crankcase. It was a crack about 3 inches long over the top of the crankcase.
Okay, well, Continental has very specific rules. Was this a Continental or Lycoming engine? Did you say it was the IO360?
Yeah.
Because that's kind of ambiguous.
Continental.
Both Continental IO360s. Continental has a very specific service bulletin about case cracks, and they divide the crankcase into 2 areas, what they call the critical area and the non-critical area. Basically, if you draw a line that connects the top hold-down studs for all the cylinders, anything above that line is non-critical, anything below the line is critical. It sounds like this crack was in the non-critical area, and the rules for the non-critical area are that if the crack is less than 2 inches long and it's not leaking oil, then it's acceptable. If it's more than 2 inches long, and this one's 3, or it is leaking oil, then the crack is not acceptable and the engine has to be torn down. I don't really understand the concept of sending a case out for x-ray because if there was a visible crack that was 3 inches long in the non-critical area, that per se is disqualifying under the Continental guidelines. And so there really isn't any further testing that needs to be done. That crankcase would be toast if I understand what he's talking about. A crack presumably emanating from one of the upper hold-down stud bosses and continuing upward on the case. If the crack was less than 2 inches long and wasn't leaking oil, you could continue to fly, but if it's longer than 2 inches, you can't.
All right, if Dan has further question, we'll just have him contact you directly.
Sure, absolutely. If you'd like to discuss this in detail with me, absolutely. Go ahead and email me. My email address is on the screen.
Thanks, Mike. I had a number of questions come in here about magnetos, and the questions about the manufacturer's requirement of a 500-hour overhaul of magnetos. And what's your comment and discussion on the 500-hour required overhaul of a magneto?
Well, first of all, there is no requirement for 500-hour overhaul of magnetos. The requirement, and it's not a requirement, it's a mere suggestion because it's a manufacturer specified number and it's not required by the FAA. But the suggestion is that the magneto go through a specific a teardown inspection, what we call an IRAN, inspect and repair as necessary, every 500 hours. That requirement is not required by regulation, but in our view, it's very, very important to do, and we religiously adhere to doing 500-hour magneto teardowns. The reason we believe in it, although in most cases we don't believe in following manufacturers' time-directed recommendations, but in this case we believe in it because, and I did a whole webinar on magnetos when I get where I get into that in depth, but because of two things. First of all, it is impossible for a mechanic to inspect a magneto and determine its condition without removing it from the engine and tearing it down. There is no way to inspect the magneto while it's on the engine or while it's intact. There's no place to stick a borescope in. There's no kind of non-destructive testing that can be done. So the only way that we can determine magneto condition, unfortunately, is to remove the magneto from the engine and disassemble it. Second of all, the magnetos have a lot of very fragile parts. There's a lot of plastic in a magneto. The gears, the distributor gear, and so on are all plastic. A whole bunch of the other parts in magnetos are plastic, and they have a tendency to break and to shed teeth on the gears and so on. So failure of a magneto is a fairly common occurrence, unfortunately. And the third factor is the consequences of magneto failure. And although we have two of them, and theoretically there's some redundancy there, history shows that magneto failures frequently result in accidents or incidents. Some of that could be cured with some better pilot education, but magneto failures occur fairly often, and they often result in bad outcomes. So the consequences can be fairly serious. So for all of those reasons, we're quite religious about having our clients do 500-hour mag IRANs. It is not required to overhaul a mag. It is only required to do a specific teardown inspection that's documented in the magneto manual. And the typical cost of a 500-hour IRAN on most mags ranges between $300 and $400 a magneto, and then there's some additional time, labor involved in removing and reinstalling the magneto and setting the timing again. But we believe very strongly in doing that every 500 hours for the reasons I stated, even though it's not required by regulation. Did I lose you, Tim? Uh-oh.
Hi, Mike.
There you
Michelle,
go.
yeah. Michelle is wondering if you could just recap what are the methods used to bring compression up on a cylinders if you get a low cylinder reading. You mentioned it on one of the top overhaul slides.
Right. Well, what I was referring to, and we were talking about a Continental IO550 engine. Continental has this marvelous service bulletin called SBO3-3 that was issued about 10 years ago in 2003, and is basically the Bible for how decisions should be made on whether to pull a cylinder or not. And basically what SBO3-3 says is that first of all, the threshold of the compression threshold, the minimum allowable compression, is not a fixed number, but it's established by using the particular compression tester involved and first testing, connecting that tester to something called a master orifice, which is a calibrated leak that represents the largest acceptable leak. And for most compression testers, and you're supposed to recalibrate the compression tester every time you use it. For most compression testers, that threshold winds up being somewhere in the low 40s. I've seen it as low as 38. I've seen it as high as 45. For most compression testers, it's going to be somewhere in the low 40s. If the compression reading comes in below that value, then Continental, first of all, recommends rechecking the compression but turning the propeller in the opposite direction of normal rotation. In other words, bringing the piston up to top dead center in the opposite direction, which sometimes has a profound effect on the compression reading depending on where the ring gaps happen to set. If that doesn't work, and if the leakage is past the exhaust valve, which it very, very often is, usually, most of the time when a cylinder flunks a compression test, it's usually because there's leakage past the exhaust valve. They recommend what's called staking the valve, which is removing the rocker cover, pressurizing the cylinder, and then using a rubber mallet to jar the exhaust valve and try to get it to seat more tightly. And sometimes that staking procedure with the rubber mallet will bring the compression up quite dramatically by 10 or 20 points. And sometimes it won't have any effect at all. It just depends on exactly what kind of leak we have. If rotating the prop in the opposite direction doesn't fix it, doesn't bring the compression up above master orifice value, and if staking the exhaust valve doesn't bring it up, then what SBO 3-3 recommends is buttoning up the airplane, going out and flying it for a minimum of 45 minutes, and then bringing it back and testing the one cylinder that flunked the test immediately upon taxiing in, when the cylinder is as hot as it possibly can be. I have seen cases with our managed airplanes where a cylinder measured 38/80, went out for an hour's flight, came back, and tested 72/80. So we never ever want to accept a single compression reading as the basis for removing a cylinder. We always want to go through the full protocol in an attempt to bring the compression reading up to an acceptable value. And for Continental engines, an acceptable value would be 45 or more before we make a commitment to pull a cylinder. Now, the one exception to that rule is that Continental also wants us to bore scope the cylinders anytime we do a compression test. And as I have said many times in my writings and in some of these webinars, the bore scope is a much, much better and more accurate tool for assessing a cylinder condition than the compression test is. But if we stick a bore scope in the cylinder and we see a clearly burned exhaust valve with a lopsided pattern on it, an obvious hot spot, then regardless of what the compression is, we're probably going to pull that cylinder, because an obviously burned exhaust valve is going to fail, and we don't want it to fail in flight. As I've said on a number of occasions, compression testers lie all the time, but bore scopes never lie, at least in the hands of somebody who knows what he's looking for. And so if we see an obviously burned exhaust valve with a bore scope, we're going to pull the cylinder regardless of what the compression tester says. If we see a low compression, we're going to do everything in our power to bring that compression up to an acceptable level before we make a commitment to pull a cylinder.
Okay, Kevin asks, how can an owner tell if maintenance truly is needed, especially in light of all the bad calls by IAs you've presented?
Read my articles, watch my webinars. What can I say? It just takes a lot of learning for aircraft owners to do that. I use every communications medium in my power to try to get the word out about how we should be doing this stuff. I also run a managed maintenance practice for owners who would like somebody like me or one of my guys that all of us preach out of the same prayer book to oversee their maintenance. We don't do maintenance, but we oversee it, and we try to advise owners what maintenance is worth doing and what maintenance isn't worth doing, and we communicate directly with their mechanics. But I do everything that I can to teach owners how to do that for themselves, because I understand that only a tiny fraction of aircraft owners are going to want to have professionally managed maintenance. So I've dedicated a lot of my life over the last 20 years to trying to get the word out. But it does require putting in some study, and a good place to start would be to go to sportaviationonline.org and start at the January 2010 issue and read all the Savvy Aviator columns, because I sure have talked a lot about all of these things in the magazine. And of course we have this great webinar archive that EAA has put together as well.
Excellent. Take advantage of the resources that are already developed. Jim is
and finally, anytime if you have a question, you've got my email address, and I'm always happy to help.
Right. Jim says, so if you had a single cylinder that had to be overhauled, what would you consider a reasonable number of hours accumulated on that new cylinder before you would feel comfortable flying in all flight conditions?
The removal of a single cylinder is a relatively low-risk event. You're only relieving the torque on 2 of the 8 through bolts that hold the engine together, so there's almost no likelihood when you're removing a single cylinder of any sort of main bearing displacement or spun bearing or the kinds of things that cause these engines to come apart after multiple cylinder replacement. If the mechanic does something stupid like not torque down the hold down nuts correctly or put sealant on the O-ring when he's not supposed to, or any number of things that he could do wrong, usually the worst thing that can happen is the cylinder will come off. And if it's a 6-cylinder engine, you'll fly on 5 cylinders. If it's a 4-cylinder engine, you'll probably wind up putting it down in the field. But the risk of replacing 1 cylinder is not very high. It's finite. It's there. There is some risk involved. But the likelihood of the engine coming apart in a catastrophic way and falling out of the sky is vastly less when replacing a single cylinder than when replacing multiple cylinders at the same time, particularly replacing either all the cylinders on one side of an engine or all the cylinders, period. Because under those scenarios, you're basically untorquing almost all the through bolts and putting the engine in a very precarious position. There are ways to mitigate that risk, but there isn't one mechanic out of 100 that takes those precautions, in my experience. And I simply do not like seeing all cylinders or all cylinders on one side of an engine removed by anybody but an engine shop, because they know what they're doing. Mechanics in the field, it's very hard to know whether they're going to do it right, and there's so many ways to do it wrong, either inadvertently or, well, I mean, it's usually inadvertent, but it's usually errors of omission or something. But it's pretty dangerous, and it spooks me enough that I try very hard to advise my clients not to expose themselves to that risk. Some of them do, some of them ignore my advice, some of them follow my advice, but that's how I feel about it.
Okay, Bob asks, what do you recommend for oil change intervals on TIO 540s? My last plane was every 50 hours. Now with bigger engine, I have been told 25, but at 25 the oil is still fairly clean looking and has only burned 1/2 quart.
We normally recommend for our clients that mostly are flying large engines, and many of them turbocharged engines, to do oil changes at 50 hours or 4 calendar months, whichever comes first. So if you're flying 150 hours a year or more, you'll probably go the full 50 hours. If you're flying less than that, you'll probably change at less than 50 hours because the 4 months will come first. The only time we recommend using a shorter oil change interval than that is either if the oil analysis is starting to look questionable, in which case we'll typically recommend shortening the oil change interval until we can figure out what's going on, or if the aircraft is engaged in operations off of dirt strips or in very dusty conditions or something that would cause the oil to get dirty more rapidly. Certainly, if your oil is still nice and translucent at 25 hours, I don't see any reason for changing the oil at 25 hours unless you're flying very little. But for most of our clients, our guideline is 50 hours or 4 calendar months, whichever comes first.
Okay. And Jordan has a question here. He says, I own a 1962 Cessna 310, and my right engine fluid hoses are from the engine overhaul in 1999 and 1,200 hours ago. What is your recommendation for replacement of these hoses? I've heard 5 years, 7 years, and 10 years. They are in all fire sleeved. What's your take on this?
The official answer to that question is that for rubber hoses, 5 years is the normal interval. I think that's way too conservative, particularly for hoses that are fire sleeved. I would normally recommend changing them at 10 years, but I would also recommend not using rubber hoses in the first place. And when you do the hose change, I would recommend spending another 15 or 20% and putting in Teflon hoses with integral fire sleeves instead of the rubber hoses. Teflon hoses, which are often called lifetime hoses, they're not really lifetime, but they last for a very, very, very long time and normally are never replaced except at engine overhaul time. I've got all Teflon hoses in my airplane. They had rubber hoses originally, and when I overhauled the engine in 1990, I put Teflon hoses in, and those hoses are still there, 23 years later. The only time I would not use a Teflon hose is in an application that involves a lot of flex. For example, a landing gear brake hose on an oleo strut airplane where the hose flexes a whole lot every time you land. But for flammable fluid carrying hoses in an engine compartment where the movement is quite small, I mean the engine rocks a little bit on its shock mounts, but the hoses don't bend all that much. I wouldn't use anything but Teflon hoses with integral fire sleeves, and those things can go pretty much the life of an engine. So my recommendation would to this 310 owner would be to change the hoses at 10 years and put in Teflon hoses and then not worry about it anymore.
Okay. Robert asks, how do you know when it's time to overhaul a prop if you don't go by the TBO?
Well, what we do is start with the manufacturer's recommended TBO, knowing that TBO is calibrated, as all manufacturers' TBOs are, to the worst case airplane in the fleet, and then consider the various factors that should mitigate the need for overhaul and adjust the interval accordingly. So, for example, for an airplane that flies frequently and is hangared, or one that lives in a very low corrosion risk environment like Denver or Tucson or something, we're very comfortable in going to between 2 and 3 times the recommended calendar limit. So if it's a 6-year, typically props TBOs are 4, 5, or 6 years, the calendar component of them. and we're generally comfortable going twice that or even 3 times that if we assess that the airplane is at very low risk for internal corrosion. If the airplane is in a less desirable situation, it lives on the coast and it's tied down outdoors or something, in circumstances like that, we might recommend complying with the manufacturer's calendar time TBO. But those TBOs are calibrated to the worst case airplane in the fleet. They really have to be, and so we make common sense adjustments to sort of the same thing where I was saying to the 310 owner, those hoses where they normally recommend changing them at 5 years. His hoses are all fire sleeved, which means that they're protected against heat cycles and so on. And so, I'm comfortable with those hoses going to 10 years because of that. We just start with the manufacturer's TBO and then make common sense adjustments based on the actual operating conditions that we know that particular airplane is subject to. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but if not, you can try again.
Okay, Michelle says, throwing a rod seems to be a reoccurring problem. What are the main causes that lead to throwing a rod?
Well, the most common reason for a rod to be thrown is because the engine loses oil pressure, and lubrication failure causes the rod to be thrown. One of the pictures that I showed there, at least one of them, was actually caused, and we know this because of a lot of forensic analysis that was done in connection with the lawsuit, was caused by the mechanic failing to removing a rod, which we don't like to ever see done in the field, and then putting it back together and not properly torquing one of the rod bolts, and not putting a cotter pin in to safety that rod bolt. And so the nut gradually backed off on that rod bolt. Eventually the rod cap broke and the rod was thrown through the side of the case. That's a kind of an unusual case, but it just goes to underscore the fact that if you let a mechanic in the field do open heart surgery on your engine, there's a finite probability that he's going to screw something up. And so we like to try to minimize the opportunities for those screw-ups. And the way you do that is to not allow invasive maintenance unless it is absolutely necessary. And the more invasive it is, the more resistant you should be. And if invasive maintenance is absolutely necessary, then if possible, we like to see it done by a specialist who we are confident knows what he's doing because he does it every single day. So, I would feel a whole lot better about a top overhaul being done at an engine shop than having it be done in the field by a mechanic who is not particularly an engine specialist. So, we try to do common sense things like that. If you think about surgery and medicine, then you would do those same things. You would try to avoid invasive procedures if a less invasive procedure was an option, and if you had to have an invasive procedure, you would work really hard to make sure that the absolute best surgeon you could find was the guy who was doing it. We just use the same approach when we're dealing with invasive maintenance on airplanes.
Okay, and getting close to the end of our allotted time here. We got a few more minutes left. Just a quick comment. Do you have one on the proposed AD for ECI cylinders for the 520s and 550 Continentals?
Boy, do I ever. In fact, I just finished writing a scathing article on that subject that I sent to Mac McClellan yesterday, and I'm not sure whether he's going to run it in sport aviation or not. but anybody who's interested in my views, don't get me started here because we're way out of time, but anybody who's interested in my views on that subject, drop me an email. I'll send you a copy of the article manuscript. And also, I've filed 3 lengthy comments to the docket. So if you go online at regulations.gov, you can, I think there are about 300 docket comments in the docket now, and 3 of those 300 are for me. So, but if anybody's interested in my take on this whole thing, drop me an email and I'll send you a copy of the article.
Awesome. Okay, and last question here. Steve wonders, what do you prefer, synthetic oil or regular mineral-based oil?
Well, that's a complicated question, and I address it in depth in both a webinar that's on the EAA server called All About Oil, and also a 2-part article in Sport Aviation that I did back in, I think, 2010. But the short version is, as long as we are using leaded avgas, I strongly prefer to use oil that does not have any synthetics in it, because the synthetic that they use in piston aircraft oil, which is something called polyalpha olefin, does not get along well with the lead that's in the avgas. When the day comes, and I'm not sure when that's going to be exactly, that we're running our engines on unleaded avgas, then the whole issue will need to be reconsidered, and I think that there will be a resurgence of synthetic oils for piston aircraft engines, and engines that are running on unleaded auto gas, for example. I don't have any problem at all using synthetic oil in those engines. But if you're using leaded fuel, I feel pretty strongly that you should not be using synthetics.
Sounds good, Mike. Well, thank you so much for the presentation tonight. It was excellent, of course, and to all the attendees, thank you so much for your questions. I apologize that we weren't able to get through everyone's question tonight.
And of course, as usual, anybody who had a question that didn't get answered, feel free to drop me an email, and I'll be glad to answer it with you one-on-one.
Thanks, Mike. And it looks like October 2nd is the next time you're doing a webinar, and that's flying efficiently in a world of $7 half gas. Oh, gosh. That'll be a good one. Try and save as much money wherever you can.
You betcha.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mike. You have a great night, and to all the attendees, have a great night tonight. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.